All right. Hello. Welcome back. We are going to continue with this Weisberg Kerry Thornley archive. This is going to be part 2. We are going to cover today an interview with Kerry Thornley from a key time period, January 14th, 1968. Amazing time period here. So can anybody tell me why this is an amazing time period for Kerry Thornley to be interviewed? Well, the answer is this date, January 14th, 1968, is right between the time that Clayshaw was arrested and the Clayshaw trial began, which didn't begin until January of 1969. So this is a year before the Clayshaw trial and about, 6-7 months after Clayshaw was arrested, right? So it's a very crucial period here. People shouldn't be running their goddamn mouths. But Kerry Thornley is, he likes to run his mouth. If you haven't picked up on that yet, he likes to run his goddamn mouth. So this interview is from Channel 13 WTVT TV, Tampa, Florida, from 1 to 1:30 p.m., January 14th, 1968. The announcer for the next 30 minutes, Kerry W. Thornley, will discuss Lee Harvey Oswald and New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison as Channel 13 News presents Insight, a public affairs program of Channel 13 News. Here is News Director Ray Dantzler. Dantzler, good afternoon. Our guest on Insight today is the most recently publicized name on a rather long list in the possession of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison. 29-year-old Kerry W. Thornley is a freelance writer living in Tampa since last October, and earlier last week was subpoenaed by Garrison reportedly in that district attorney's continuing investigation into the November 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Joining me on the Insight panel this afternoon are Cy Smith of the WTVT editorial department and Gil Butler of the Channel 13 news staff. Mr. Thornley, on Tuesday of this week, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison said he had issued a subpoena for you. In effect, you failed to tell the whole truth when you testified before the Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination of President Kennedy. Specifically, he said you told the commission you never saw Lee Harvey Oswald after you served together in the Marine Corps. He then went on to charge you with having been, quote, closely associated. Those are his words, with Oswald, in a number of places in New Orleans in September of 1963. Do you have any reason to believe that you may have given the Warren Commission bad information, either intentionally or inadvertently? Thornley, no, I don't have any reason to believe that I gave the Warren Commission bad information. I believe that I told them everything that I thought was relevant at the time. At that time, I was, of course, convinced that Oswald had been the lone assassin, as were, I think, most of us then. The business about being seen with Oswald in New Orleans, I think in the first place, I think Mr. Garrison is exaggerating the information he has at hand, and I think the information he has comes from a woman named Barbara Reed, who shortly after the assassination told me she was certain that she saw me and Oswald sitting together in the Bourbon House in New Orleans, which was kind of a local gathering place and was one of my hangouts. And it later turned out was a place that had been frequented by Oswald. So let me just pause right here and remind you that who was it? Gus Beeler, who was the manager of the Bourbon House. He claims he never saw Oswald in his bar ever, not once. Like, he never saw him, never saw Jack Ruby. These people are never alleged to have been at the Bourbon House. As per Bourbon House staff. So, that statement right here, we can say, is most likely false. But you were not sitting with Oswald there at the time? Well, when she told me this, she had been sitting nearby, and I didn't know her back at this time. And on this day when she had claimed she saw us sitting together, but she had said something to me. I was talking to this person, whoever I did happen to be sitting with at the time, and she said to me something about my voice. She said it was a compliment. I don't remember exactly what, but she interrupted the conversation to say this. I felt kind of embarrassed, and I said, well, thank you. She went back to what she had to say to whoever she was talking to. She was sitting up at the bar, and I was sitting at this table in the corner, and I went back to talking to whoever I was talking to. Now, after the assassination, this was several weeks before the assassination. I don't remember when. After the assassination, she said that day when she had made that remark to me that the person I had been sitting next to was Oswald, and I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes." So I said, "Well, are you sure it wasn't?" And I started naming people, Are you sure it wasn't Dave Carpenter? Are you sure it wasn't this person? And I just went down this list, and she knew all these people, or claimed to, she was sure it wasn't any of these people. So I became, I thought, gee whiz, did he walk into the place? And we concocted a theory right there when Barbara and I were talking. She wasn't being hostile toward me when she said this. And we concocted the theory that maybe I had been sitting there and maybe Oswald had come walking into the door and maybe I had looked at him, not recognized him as Oswald from the Marine Corps, but seen his face, familiar. A lot of people in the French Quarter didn't want to insult him by pretending not to know who he was. Same thing from him, us sitting down, small talk for a while, and him... She said that she remembered him saying something about just having taken his wife back to Dallas and so forth. This, mind you, was all she said by Barbara after the word was out, out that Oswald had been to Dallas and had been in New Orleans and had known me in the Marine Corps. So I began to think, wow, maybe I've got a case of amnesia here or something, because I couldn't remember for certain who it was I was talking to. It was weeks ago, and I know a lot of people. So... if you haven't read my book, I emphasize in my book how full of absolute shit Kerry Thornley is. And this is just a great example right here when he is in this middle of this interview and hasn't testified at Clay Shaw's trial, right? So he shouldn't be saying any of this damn stuff. But he hasn't been subpoenaed yet because Garrison is trying to get a subpoena to him. Right? So instead of talking to Garrison, what does he do? He goes on the news in Tampa, Florida, and he starts to say a whole lot of things that will later be contradicted. And then he comes up with this story about Barbara Reed. Who, remember Barbara Reed? If you haven't read my book, you wouldn't know this, but in my book, I mentioned how Barbara Reed saw them at I don't believe it was the Bourbon House. Maybe it was the Bourbon House. But she saw them together and said that they looked like the Gold Dust twins. Right? So, yeah, so he's lying, obviously. So the next day I brought this up to some of Barbara's friends, and they said, oh, don't worry about it. They said she always does this, everything happens of any importance. She imagines that somehow she's right in the middle of it or right on the edge of it. And the more I ask around, the more this was confirmed, so I just dismissed it. Are you convinced in your mind, then, that you knew Oswald well enough when you were in the Marine Corps with him that you would have recognized him if it had been him? I think I would have recognized him, There's always the off chance that out of context of the Marine Corps situation and having no idea that he was in New Orleans, I would not have recognized him. But it's such a remote possibility that I don't really consider it, Taking this thing about your knowing Oswald in the Marine Corps, he impressed you enough, apparently, for you to write a novel based on a character which was based on Oswald. Is this true? Yes. Well, he impressed me for a number of reasons. For one thing, he kind of got thrown together in the beginning because I was an atheist at that time, and so was he. And there were a lot of very fundamentalist types of guys in this outfit who had the missionary spirit, and we kind of get cornered, and we'd be, defending our views against theirs. And the thing was, where we disagreed, where Oswald was a communist at the time, I'd say, sort of an extreme liberal, but I had a very definite reservations about communism. And so when he and I would get into arguments with each other, would be usually on the subject of communism. And at this time, he impressed me because he was articulate. He was able to defend his views, and he was intelligent, and he also had a sense of humor, and he said some funny things now and then. And he had very rebellious attitude. And that, as far as I was concerned, and as far as most of us were concerned, was fine, because we lived in an outfit where the esprit was definitely on the side of enlisted man, the sort of against the power structure in the outfit. And so that all impressed me to some degree, but not enough to write a book based on him. What caused me to make that decision is when I read in the Stars and Stripes about, the second or third page little article about a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a former Marine, just walked into the American embassy in Moscow, plopped down his passport. My first reaction was, he really meant it. I thought he was a parlor communist. I thought it was just a bunch of theoretical interest on his part, and this surprised me. And I also was, at the time, I read this article in the Stars and Stripes about Oswald's defection. I was in the outfit that Oswald had been in when he was overseas. I was in Marine Air Control Squadron 1. I had met Oswald after he had come back from overseas and before I had left for overseas. How long a period was this? It was about a 3-month period when he mustered out of the service shortly after I left for overseas, I understand. And when I got over there, I began to see what he had against the United States, and particularly the military, because I saw Marines beating up taxicab drivers. I saw them, pushing people around because they could get away with it over there. In Japan, to some degree, and particularly in Formosa in the Philippines, and Oswald called this U.S. imperialism. I still think that it was sort of an exaggerated view of it, but it was a very important thing. It was turning. I think that sort of thing, trained killers on liberty in peaceful allied foreign nations, does a lot to stimulate anti-American attitudes. The impression I get of Oswald from reading these things we read about him was that he was somewhat of an unstable character and a flighty thinker, that maybe he didn't believe in so much some of the things, he was just unhappy about things. Thornley says yes. And I also get the impression that some of the unhappiness was more of a matter of personality rather than pure intellectual decisions that he had made. Would you call him that kind of person? Yes. That would be unhappy maybe wherever he was. I think so, yeah. I don't know if he was unhappy wherever he was. He seemed to have a certain built-in thing in his psychology where he always managed to come up with a grievance. The last time he and I spoke was one day when we were out sitting on one Saturday morning. We were out sitting around waiting for a parade to start. And it was just, it was just a stupid thing. It was just one of these things the military has where some guys were retiring from the Marine Corps, so they wake up a bunch of grumpy enlisted men and cancel their liberty for that day and take them out and parade them back and forth in front of them. And Oswald was making comments on the stupidity of it. And I had just read 1984, and his recommendation and the words comrade and revolution was used very much in 1984, as well as by communists. And I said, thinking about this book, I said, well, comes the revolution, comrade. Can you change all of that? And he looked at me and he said, not you too, Thornley, and got up and walked off. What did you take that to mean? Well, I took it to mean that I was joining the others in the outfit and attacking him for being a communist, which wasn't what I had meant. But I decided, well, the fact that he had jumped to a conclusion that quickly, I decided there was no point in trying to rectify it, and so I just forgot about it, and that's the last time we ever spoke to each other. Do you feel now that Oswald was the lone assassin, or was the assassin at all? No, I don't. The reason I don't is because some time ago, now scanned through the 26 volumes of supportive evidence supposedly for the conclusions of the Warren Commission. And the first thing I saw in there that I had read the Warren Commission report very carefully in writing Oswald, because I was not only writing about, the publisher not only wanted me to say what I knew about him, he wanted me to imagine what was going through his mind as he committed the assassination and all this sort of thing. So I really had to research what the Warren Commission report had said, because that was all the available data at the time. This book, Oswald, is based on the assassination, actually. Thornley, right. And so I was very familiar with the Warren report, and there was one section there where this man named Deputy Sheriff Craig had told someone that he had seen Oswald running from the book depository and getting into a car that later turned out to resemble Ruth Paine's car very much just after the assassination. And they said, well, this couldn't be because Deputy Sheriff Craig is an unreliable witness. And they paraphrased this by proving something that was supposed to have happened earlier, where Craig was supposed to have said he walked into an office and identified Oswald after custody had been taken of him, and Oswald had stood up very dramatically and looked at him and said, now everyone will know who I am. This seems so ridiculous that you thought, well, what's wrong with this Craig? Is he some kind of nut? But if you read Craig's testimony in the 26 volumes, that's not all what happened. Oswald leaned forward and looked at the police captain who was questioning him and said, now everybody will know who I am, objecting to them dragging Craig in to identify him. He didn't even apparently at this time know he was being accused of the assassination, and he was objecting to this invasion of his privacy, apparently. Do you feel he would be capable of it just from your knowledge of Oswald, from your association with him? Basically, that's what I was saying in my book, Oswald, was that I felt he could be capable of it, and I was explaining why, what I thought would motivate him if he was, if he did it. What was your initial reaction when you first heard about the assassination? My initial reaction was, well, Oswald's got himself into something again. He was always getting himself into things where he really wasn't to blame, but he would attract suspicion, he would go out of his way to get himself accused or something, and afterwards he would lord it around about, how persecuted he was. And I thought, well, he'd done it again, why doesn't the character use good sense? And as he kept going on, I began to wonder. But for quite a while, I was pretty sure he was innocent, and then they killed him. Or Ruby killed him, and then I experienced a real feeling of shock when that happened, because I had never seen anyone that I had known and talked to and so forth on the front page of the paper getting shot in the gut, and then the evidence kept piling up according to the papers against Oswald. I automatically assumed, well, he must have been guilty. Then I began to think, well, if he was guilty, what was going through his head? Try to do some amateur head shrinking. How long were you in New Orleans? I was in New Orleans for approximately 3 years. Let me bounce some names here which come up in Garrison's investigation and just ask you for a yes or no if you know them personally. Okay. How about David Ferry? No. How about Perry Raymond Russo from Baton Rouge? No. Clay Shaw? No. Vernon Bundy? No. Alvin Beaubouf? No. Miguel Torres? No. Fred Lemons? No. John Kankler? No. Do you know Ruby personally? No. Eugene Davis, a bar owner in New Orleans? Eugene Davis? No. How about a Walter Sheridan? No. William Gerlich? Were you ever questioned by Gerlich when he was with Garrison, when he was Garrison's former chief investigator? No, I don't recall any of those names. How about J. Garrett Underhill? No. And George de Mohrenschildt? De Mohrenschildt, I heard through Jenner. Jenner mentioned de Mohrenschildt. Jenner was the counsel of the Warren Commission who questioned me. Afterwards, we went over to the Supreme Court cafeteria and had lunch, and on the way back, he was telling me about who he would enjoy talking to and so forth, and de Mohrenschildt was one of the people he mentioned then. I'm going to pause real quickly here, okay, because I really just love it when names pop up that I don't know or that I don't know enough, and there's a couple of them here. Those names in particular are Fred Lemons, John Kankler, and I believe that is it. So let me point something out here. This interview is being done by a television news reporter in Tampa in 1968, January 1968, a year before the Clay Shaw trial. The Clay Shaw trial, he would deny knowing David Ferry, he would deny knowing Clay Shaw and all these people. But remember, if you've read my book, you will know that he, in his confession letter to Garrison that he wrote in the mid to late 70s, in his confession letter, he clearly indicated that, yeah, he did possibly know David Ferry because he went to a party at his house. I don't remember if he mentions Clay Shaw or not, but once he puts himself in the presence of David Ferry, it is game over for Kerry Thornley. What does he say here? What about Walter Sheridan? He says no, but in his confession letter to Garrison, he admits that he knew Walter Sheridan and that he knew Townley, Rick Townley, right, at WDSU, and he also had connections at WSHO, which was the radio station that was owned at the time of the assassination by Hank Greenspun. So, what we have here is Kerry Thornley lying. He's just lying, right? Why would you lie if you're innocent? You wouldn't. So, question, but you did not know him yourself. Oh, no. He's talking about George de Mohrenschildt. No, he was, I believe, someone in the Dallas Russian community. Yes, he was a white Russian refugee in Dallas. We've got a couple more of these names, and then we'll move on. How about Hugh Borden? Guy Bannister. Both of them are supposed to run a private detective agency in New Orleans. All right, so let me take that screenshot because Hugh Borden is not a name that pops up very often. Thornley. Guy Bannister rings a bell. I don't know why, but it does. I don't remember reading it in connection with the Garrison assassination, the Garrison investigation. Okay, so here we go, 1968, and he's telling him he does not know Guy Bannister. However, I go over in my book, remember the relationship between Kerry Thornley and Jessica Luck. Jessica Luck then introduces Kerry Thornley to Martin McAuliffe. Martin McAuliffe will then introduce Thornley to Guy Bannister, in which they talk about his book on Oswald, allegedly, right? But here he is. This is 5 years after that. And he's denying to this television interview that he knows any of these people, right? He'll deny it at the Clay Shaw trial. It's not until his confession letter to Garrison that he admits all of this stuff. Well, I think Guy Bannister also was the pilot of a plane in which Delespis Morrison crashed at the time. Gordon Novell, who supposedly worked pretty close with Ferry, did you? So there's something redacted here, and I don't know what's redacted. So this second indent where it says Gordon Novell, that shouldn't be an indent, okay? So there is something redacted here, covertly redacted after this sentence. Well, I think Guy Bannister also was the pilot of a plane in which Delespis Morrison crashed at the time. And then you have a long line. You have an empty line. That line is empty, right? It should not be empty. There should not be an indent here for Gordon Novell in the next sentence, but there is. So this tells me something was redacted here. I don't like that at all. Why was something redacted from what one time was a public statement? Gordon Novell, who supposedly worked pretty close with Ferry, did you ever know him? No, I didn't. Some of these names I heard after they came out in connection with Garrison's investigation, but never before then. One more here. PFC Eugene Dinkin. Dinkin. Does that ring a bell with you anywhere? Nope. Supposedly there is a report on him, according to Mr. Garrison, which the CIA has locked in its archives, and he was questioning why, and I was just wondering if he happened to have been a Marine Corps associate of yours or Oswald's. Not that I know of. Did you know of any people you say you didn't just by accident apparently run into Oswald while you were there most recently? Did you have several common friends that you know of? Well, like it has turned out since then that I know people whose relatives know Clay Shaw, you know. It's such a Kerry Thornley sentence. Well, like it has turned out since then that I know people whose relatives know Clay Shaw, you know. And I know people, I know a girl, I believe, who went with Rousseau at one time. But also I know about 5 or 6 people who know Garrison. You know, New Orleans, particularly the French Quarter, is not that big a town and the kind of thing happens. But I never knew of any of these people and never even knew that I knew people who knew them before it came out in the papers. Can't you see how Kerry Thornley is possibly like the most full of shit person that's ever been? Did you ever hear talk among these people that later you might have connected with the assassination, any talk about we're going to kill the president or anything like that? No, not that I can think of offhand. So let me just ask you, the audience, a question. If you're hanging out with a bunch of people and someone says we're going to kill the president, and then someone asks you about it later, would you respond by saying, not that I can think of offhand? No, you fucking wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. You'd say, no, this is ridiculous. Of course not. You wouldn't say, not that I can think of offhand. You fucking lying scumbag. Kerry Thornley wants people to know what happened. He wants everyone to know what he did. Well, you indicated yourself, I believe, that you didn't particularly care for President Kennedy. No, I didn't. I was no admirer of President Kennedy. And when the assassination happened, I saw no reason to cry crocodile tears over it because I felt that it was hypocritical. And I saw a lot of people who had been running down Kennedy the day before who were pretending to be very upset about it. That irritated me. I think I made a lot of people very angry the night Kennedy's assassination because I refused to be depressed about it, unhappy about it. this sort of thing later I came to feel, I guess I felt there was a kind of poetic justice in it, because a few days later when Oswald was assassinated, people were acting toward me just as I had acted toward them when Kennedy was assassinated, walking around kind of, smiling and taking it kind of lightly and making jokes about it. Then I could see from the other side just how sort of ghoulish this was, this kind of to just dismiss the death of another man lightly. But aside from that, I don't ever recall talking to anybody who said they thought Kennedy ought to be assassinated, and I don't. I didn't have any friends in New Orleans, particularly who shared my own views, which I've been called a right-winger, and I've been called an extreme leftist, and I've been called an anarchist, and on occasion, I've called myself all of these things in order to explain my views in one area or another. To be perfectly accurate, I would call myself a libertarian, in that I believe the total sovereignty of the individual. It's an extreme form of individualism. I believe that every man has the complete right to his own body and to anything he creates and the products of his work. So this makes me opposite to the draft on one hand and opposite to welfare programs on the other, back and forth all. Mr. Thornley, in his investigation on a number of occasions, Mr. Garrison has referred, quote, to, quote, the powerful forces in Washington as obstructing his investigation, as hiding and keeping information from him, etc. Since you were named by him on Tuesday as someone he would like to talk to again, have you had any contact with these powerful forces in Washington? Anybody suggesting you do go and tell him something? Thornley, no. A reporter from Washington called me and told me a few things about Garrison. Just confirmed more or less what I believed. One of them was that this man felt that he was perfectly capable of manufacturing evidence, which I don't know whether this is true or not. But if it is, I am now prepared for it. What about these past 3 years? Have you ever been approached by anyone remotely associated with the CIA, the FBI, any Washington force that would, not to my knowledge? Right after the assassination, the Secret Service came to see me, and they were to see me it took them, they were there at midnight. I was waiting tables in Redacted at midnight, Saturday night, I believe. They were there to see me. It was Mr. Rice and someone else, and Mr. Rice and I have found out since then is head Secret Service in New Orleans, and then a couple of days later, the FBI came to see me, Okay, so let me pause right here because this is very important. What this is going to pertain to is, this is going to pertain to Kerry Thornley's schedule, right? Kerry Thornley's schedule as to when he was first contacted by Secret Service. It took them, they were there at midnight. I was waiting tables in blanks at midnight Saturday night. I believe they were there to see me. It was Mr. Rice and someone else, and Mr. Rice, I had found out since then, is head Secret Service in New Orleans. And then a couple days later, the FBI came to see me. So Saturday night. Saturday is November the 23rd, correct? Because Friday was the 22nd, the day of the assassination. He's saying the first time that the feds, Secret Service, came and saw him was on Saturday night. This is perfect because, God, I wish I could recall the person's name. But another person, a friend of Kerry Thornley, this is in the Kerry Thornley files, the Jim Garrison Kerry Thornley files. Another person, I forget who worked with Kerry Thornley, attempts to give Thornley an alibi because that person tells Jim Garrison that the Secret Service came and saw him Friday night and that he told him that Thornley was working. God, I wish I could remember this person's name. And this was Friday night, okay? Friday, not Saturday. Friday would have been rough because Friday, what do you have going on? At around noon, you've got Kerry Thornley killing J.D. Tippit, heading back to New Orleans from Dallas. You're looking at, 7-8 hours? You're looking at him not getting back to New Orleans till the evening, 8 o'clock-ish, right? 9 o'clock-ish. Couldn't have been at work because he wasn't at fucking work because he was in Dallas, right? So this right here is Kerry Thornley putting the Secret Service contacting him on Saturday night, which is totally reasonable because he was back in New Orleans by Friday at some point, okay? So, thank you, Mr. Thornley, for once again spilling the beans and telling me things that I already knew. I'm going to have to screenshot this because this is going to have to go into an update of my book at some point. Do you think they approached you so quickly? Your book had not. They approached me so quickly because I had attracted suspicion to myself by the way I conducted myself immediately after the assassination, by not being unhappy about it and so forth, and also by knowing Oswald, these two things. So he thinks that these two things... the way that he conducted himself by not being unhappy about the assassination and the fact that he knew Oswald, he believes that those are the two things that drew the Secret Service to him. Ridiculous, of course. I know exactly why they came to me so quickly, because later I learned that a man named Tom Shimbosky, an artist in Pirates Alley, had called them. All right. Thank you for all these names, Mr. Thornley. And told them that you had known Oswald. And told them that I had known Oswald and that according to rumor I had a shotgun, and he said that I would have assassinated Kennedy. I was in position or in line to assassinate Kennedy if Oswald didn't. Well, fortunately, the rumor was a shotgun, because that's sort of an incredible assassination weapon. And I didn't have any guns, and I didn't feel that I had anything to hide, And so I talked to them, and they were extremely polite. And their minds seemed to be made up that Oswald had that moment, That night already their minds seemed to be pretty much made up that Oswald had done it as a lone assassin. At that time I thought, well, that must be because they have a lot of evidence. Since then, now that I've think back on it, and after seeing what some of the things of the 26 volumes, another thing that concerns me is Kennedy's head moves in the wrong direction to be shot from behind in those pictures. His head flies back. And the large wound, the large opening is in the back of the head. And you ask any Marine which way a bullet went in, which way a bullet went out, and it's always the largest opening is the way it went out. This is pretty fascinating, because this is before anybody saw Zapruder, right? Nobody saw Zapruder at this point. This is in January of 1968. Garrison didn't play it at the trial of Clay Shaw. He definitely didn't show it to Kerry Thornley. How the hell does Kerry Thornley know that the president's head flies back? Interesting. Well, then you agree with Mr. Garrison. I think, yeah, I agree very much with what Mr. Garrison has to say. However, this is not anything, as far as I can tell, that Mr. Garrison has turned up in his investigation. This is all the works of the critics of the assassination. What do you think Garrison is up to? Well, I don't know, of course, I think possibly he is simply a man with very poor judgment. I think possibly he's a dishonest man. I think possibly he's insane. And I think possibly it's all three. And I do think he's somewhat enamored with his own power, and particularly with the power of subpoena, forcing individuals to appear, and many times apparently on the basis of very little evidence. I refused to cooperate with him earlier in October, principally for that reason, because he had already, on the basis of something I had said to a friend or in an affidavit, called a man in to be questioned in New Orleans, a man named Hindell, who was in the Marine Corps, in the same outfit with Oswald and I, who remembered to have spoken Russian to Oswald on a couple of occasions. What was that name? Hindell? Hindell. John Rene Hindell. The spelling's different, but it's Hindell. It's Hindell. And see, it turns out in his statement in the 26 volumes, he says that he sometimes was called Hydell. Well, Hydell is the name under which Oswald's supposed to have ordered the rifle. So, some of the critics of the commission immediately got the theory on the basis of this that Hindell was a CIA agent working with Oswald and had ordered the rifle, and that Oswald never known about it, had been sharing the post office box with him under the name Hindell, and has been using the name as a CIA agent, and you see Hindell lives in New Orleans. Well, Garrison called him in. Well, Jesus Christ. Kerry Thornley using some insider information here, isn't he? It's exactly what he's doing. He's confessing again and again and again. He needs people to know that he did this without confessing, And apparently, from what I've heard from critics of the assassination, of the investigation, of the assassination by the Warren Commission, that the man was called in on the basis of simply the speculation against his will. And he brought with him a lawyer, and he was very frightened. As who wouldn't be when they're living in New Orleans and Garrison's conducting this thing, this P.T. Barnum manner that he is, and they get called in. And he didn't have anything to say, and he denied speaking Russian and so forth. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just knew a few terms. Maybe they weren't talking Russian. Maybe they were talking Pig Latin. Who knows? I just thought that it was insufficient reason to call the man in. Garrison should have gone to him, gone to his house, knocked on his door and said, I have a few questions to ask you. May I come in? Instead of forcing him to appear. Mr. Thornley, we are just about out of time. Let me ask you a couple more quickies on a yes and no basis. Have you ever been to Cuba? No. How about Russia? No. Any desire to go? No. Are you a member of the Minutemen organization? No. How about the Anti-Communist League of the Caribbean? No. Fair Play for Cuba Committee? No. Pro or con Castro? What is your philosophy? I'm anti-Castro, but I don't believe the United States government should interfere with. I'm not a nationalist. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to. We're completely out of time. Our guest on Insight today has been Kerry W. Thornley of Tampa, a former Marine Corps associate of accused presidential assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. Speaking for the panel, I'm Ray Dantzler of Channel 13 News. Good afternoon. All right. So let me read some of these miscellaneous notes here. Note, the beginning, it had been intended to identify each questioner, but this proved impossible since sometimes the voices sounded too much alike. Question, do you feel now that Oswald was the lone assassin, or was the assassin at all? Thornley, no, I don't. The reason I don't is because some time now ago I scanned, and then it breaks, and it picks up again through the 26 volumes of supportive evidence. This appears to be a copy of that page with some underlined markings, but I can't really see the relevance there. So that does it for this interview of Kerry Thornley. And the reason I really love reading these esoteric documents is because you get such golden nuggets of information, right? How many golden nuggets were in this? A ton, right? He lied about all this stuff in this interview, and then he lies again at the Clay Shaw trial. But then he tells Garrison the truth in a 50-page affidavit letter, a confession letter. I call it a confession. He would never tell you it's a confession, but it's a confession. So why else would somebody lie about any of this stuff unless they were involved heavily? And he was, because he was basically Oswald's handler in New Orleans. Primary handler in New Orleans, from what I can tell. But, all right, so this is going to be a rather short episode, but hey, I just wanted to get through this. We'll have another episode out tomorrow, and that's going to do it for me. If you have not picked up a copy of my book, please click the link in my notes. Head over to Amazon. You can pick up the paperback or the hardback or whatever the fuck they call that thing. You can pick up the ebook. If you just want to get the information real quick and you want the ebook, it's only $10. And it's got links. All my links are built right into the book itself. So, yeah. I want to make the information as accessible as possible. But I'll be back tomorrow or the next day with another episode of Weisberg's Kerry Thornley Files. Until then, I'll see you.